How's life in California treating you?
Very nice, thank you.
Great. So David, you came to Princeton after completing your master's degree at LSE, where, if memory serves me correctly, you were a classmate of Dave Donaldson, your current colleague. And then you came to Princeton and took my trade course in the fall of 2004, if my arithmetic is correct. And you went on to write your dissertation under Angus Deaton and me. Then you made stops at Yale and UCLA before joining the MIT faculty in 2015. Were promoted to tenure in 2017. And these days you're one of the leaders in the intersection between trade and development economics. And you're just about the most creative empirical economist I know. So let me start by having you reflect on your Princeton experience. In particular, you were one of only 2 students ever to work with Angus and me as advisors. I'm wondering whether that was a bit disoriented or how you managed to manage our different approaches and styles.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So that's a great question. So, as you're aware, having a great supervisor is a blessing. So having 2 is even better. And I guess I didn't find it too disorienting. If you're interested in doing empirical work in trade, it's naturally quite a theoretical field, and so you need to definitely think through all of your empirics in terms of a theoretical base. And so having a empirically minded supervisor in Angus and a more theoretically minded one in you, I think was an excellent combination. And I struggled to think how a trade empiricist would get by with only one of those 2 bits of guidance. And of course, you are a notable empiricist yourself, although maybe slightly longer ago then.
So are you claiming that we never gave you any conflicting advice?
I think on the specific papers, not so much conflicting advice, maybe on like what topics are more interesting or less interesting, some differences in opinion maybe, but once a specific project's going, then one end people are trying to think about how to make that point more convincingly, and the other are asking why you're asking that point and whether or not that's the right point to be asking, and both of those are compliments, I think. Maybe I'm misremembering. You may have memory. I didn't remember any Discord, but
yeah, graduate school always looks better when you look back on it than when you're in the midst of it, I guess. So let's turn to the research you've been doing since you left Princeton. And why don't we begin with a high-level overview? Do you have a research agenda? Do you think of it in those terms that you could describe? Is there a unifying theme where you just go for whatever problem seems interesting at the moment, or what's your research approach? So
certainly at Princeton and coming out of Princeton, I definitely saw a quite focused agenda as thinking about the impacts of trade on the lives of the poor and in developing countries. That's continued to be definitely a focus of the work I do. Why? I mean, in my mind, certainly, these were kind of the mid-2000s when I started the PhD. And I guess I'd look around me, and most of the discussion you'd see about trade would involve poor countries, poverty, impacts on poverty, etc. And it seemed like there was a bit of a disconnect between how much focus there was on developing country issues when it came to trade versus the media's attention. That's obviously changed a bit thanks to Donald Trump. There's now been a renewed interest in a variety of developed country trade issues. But at the time, I thought that was a particularly important set of questions, and I still do. I guess recently I've also become quite interested in maybe an adjacent subject, which is industrial policy and firms in developing countries. Maybe because of our tool sets and the type of data we use, that's typically been an area where there's been a lot of interest from people who are also interested in trade, and that's also an area which is of considerable interest to me now. Again, a lot of important policy debates are going on, and we should, as economists, be providing more inputs into a lot of those debates. And the hope is to have an agenda that is a kind of complement with current policy questions.
And so one of the unique aspects of your work, I think, especially your work in some of the developing countries, is that you've resorted to field experiments. This is quite popular in development economics, but quite novel in trade economics. And coming from a student of Angus Deaton, it's particularly interesting since, as you know, he's one of the most vocal critics of this kind of methodology. So maybe I could get you to talk a little bit about what you see as the role of experiments in trade research, and whether you think this is going to be, a once in a while thing, or it's going to become a more standard part of our toolkit, or how do you see experiments?
Excellent question. So yeah, I guess my views and Angus's aren't so far apart in terms of the fundamentals. I guess maybe some of the details we differ on, but I know the way I see it is, what is an experiment doing? It's providing us with exogenous variation, and is particularly valuable in settings where we struggle to get exogenous variation to identify kind of causal impacts. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's a substitute for a well-posed question, or it's a substitute for careful data work. I'd say that it's a very, very strong complement with something which is very important in a lot of our trade questions, which is good data collection. Often we don't have in our standard data sets exactly what we need, specifically when we're thinking about things such as global value chains, or even what happens within firms when they start exporting. And so, if you're going to have to, collect that data yourself, then that's often done alongside randomized control trials. So those are complements in that sense. Where do I see, this being most valuable? Well, when you have a well-posed causal question, which is important for the field, then obviously being able to generate this exogenous variation is very important. I guess I'll give one example from my own work, which is we were very interested in understanding learning by exporting. It's kind of a classic question in the trade literature, but as has been highlighted in the last 20 or 30 years, it's not random which firms start exporting. In fact, we have a large body of theory suggesting that firms are selecting into exporting based on their characteristics or their productivity. And so being able to disentangle whether a firm is more productive because they're exporting or because they were more productive, and that's why they decide to export, has always been a challenge. And so that's kind of a natural causal question, where if you can generate variation in participation in exporting, you can answer that question at least for some sample where you're able to do that. So we kind of picked a number of small firms in the textiles industry in Egypt, and we're able, with the help of an NGO, to generate exogenous variation in access to foreign export markets, and able through a very detailed measurement to actually see what happened within those firms as they upgraded quality, increased their productivity, increased their profits, etc. And so, there's an example where, am I able to conclude that every industry in the world, exporting to every country in the world, has big learning by exporting impacts? No. And so, you want to do these types of exercises in other contexts in order to be more certain of those things. But it's the type of question where we struggled with observational data to make a lot of progress. And so, is there a space for this type of approach in the trade literature? I think absolutely. A lot of the critiques that come from Angus Deaton and others are that essentially it biases us towards answering certain questions that may not be the most important questions. Well, given there's maybe 3, 4, 5 RCTs in the whole trade literature, I think we're far away from reaching the point where everyone's answering questions that aren't so interesting because they're forced to use this methodology. But as part of our toolkit, alongside natural experiments, alongside some more quantitative approaches, alongside just descriptive statistics and theory-based narrowing of hypotheses, I think this is an important part of our toolkit for certain types of questions, and I expect there'll be more such experiments in the future.
So if I can just push you a little bit and channel my Angus Deaton. So how do we get from a few small firms in the textile industry in Egypt to knowing whether learning by exporting is something we should really think is first order in our thinking about trade policy and export behavior?
Well, a couple of ways you could do that. One is you could propose experiments in other contexts or settings and then see if they line up. And then obviously that's going to be a lengthy process, but you can build up an evidence base that way. The other is you can use existing techniques and see if they give us somewhat similar answers in somewhat similar settings. And then maybe the biases aren't so large in other settings, and then utilize those non-experimental technique answers in those other settings to shed light, having kind of validated them where you have experimental variation. And famously, maybe the birth of us being very fond of using experimental analysis in economics was the famous Lalonde study, I guess, out of Princeton, which showed that the existing techniques did very, very badly compared to the kind of answers you got from a randomized experiment when thinking about kind of job programs in the US. So, these are important questions for us to try and get to the bottom of if learning by exporting is an important feature of our policy, and we need to know how big it is to make the correct choices, for example.
Great. So let's stick with empirical methodology for a moment longer, but let's go to maybe the other end of the spectrum. As you know, our field has become enamored with quantitative modeling and intricate models that have been calibrated to match quote unquote moments in the data and then used to conduct quote counterfactual analysis. I don't see you doing a lot of that. You don't see me doing a lot of that. Do you have reservations? Is it just you haven't gotten there yet? Or how do you view that whole trend in our field?
An excellent question, and one I've been thinking about a bunch recently. So I have two recent papers where I've entered this.
Oh no! Don't tell me. Don't tell me.
Dabbled somewhat. Well, one's one with Treb Allen and one with Arno Kostner, which they have certainly helped a lot with some of the specifics. So I guess what's my view on this type of methodology? Again, my background is definitely coming more from reduced form applied micro approaches, which kind of thought very much about exogenous variation and natural experiments and other techniques. And, having particular moments in the data which are, very revealing about a particular conjecture or hypothesis or comparative static. And we lose some of that certainly with some of these quantitative approaches where you're matching to a whole bunch of moments that may not be particularly closely related to the particular mechanism you're studying. And so certainly, I have some reservations there, but there's obviously a lot of very good quantitative work where you are matching to moments that are very close to some of these kind of moments that the reduced form empiricists would be looking at. I guess my bigger reservation is, I see these as very powerful tools at understanding theory. You have kind of a model in mind and you start playing with it and you get very unexpected things from your quantitative model, and then you change your quantitative model and you find out what works and what doesn't. I guess my sadness is that most of that information is only held by the authors of the paper because they're encouraged to write up the paper as if this was the first model they wrote down, when in fact, this is a model that accorded to our priors, which is why they've left it in the paper, why they've stopped there. So we're often not learning things beyond our priors because you're not going to be able to publish a paper that gives you quantitative predictions that are way outside what we think is realistic. And the authors aren't writing down clearly what they've learned, and instead claiming it's all about just answering this particular question about whatever 3.7% rise in GDP when I did X, Y, and Z. And so I guess I would really push for us to share that knowledge more widely by explaining what models did work, what models didn't work, and helping us learn a little bit about some of these kind of theoretical relationships rather than, I guess, the current norms. But I think this is it's a new methodology in trade. The applied micro methodology is now much more mature, and I've seen that change dramatically over my career. what people do and what they don't do. And I suspect the same will be true for quantitative work. The type of quantitative work we'll see in 15, 20 years will be much more sophisticated and provide much quicker knowledge accumulation than the current forays.
I could speak endlessly about my reservations, but let me try one and see whether I get you to agree or defend, which is that, I mean, models are abstractions. The better the model, the more stylized it is because it allows us to focus on one particular mechanism. When you force a simple model to fit a complicated world and you don't get standard errors, you don't know what damage you're doing, and then you immediately run to counterfactuals. And what am I to make of those numbers that it generates? How am I to know that the model is not missing the key forces because you intentionally simplified it?
I think that's all valid. I get the sense, which may be over-optimistic, that in the macro literature where they've been doing this longer, people, or at least the better economists, have a good sense of what forces you'll hit with this type of model and which ones you won't. And for certain types of questions, there's some sort of agreement that it's okay to be missing on this, but not okay to be missing on that. And we don't really have that in trade yet, that kind of discipline, which maybe prevents some of what you're describing there. Although, you know, I like you have a fondness for comparative statics, which I think are often as much as we might learn from some of these exercises at present, given our methodologies. And so focusing on those types of predictions seems particularly valuable. Those are also easy to verify or validate in the data.
I'll give you one more complaint before we move on, which is, so the models often fit the data by introducing things we can't measure, like amenities and productivity. In my generation, we used to call that the error term, but now it's part of the model. But then when you do counterfactuals, you don't know what the hell they are, but you have to hold them constant. So why would we think these things would remain constant once we start changing the environment?
I guess that's the model they wrote down, where those things remain constant. I do think there's exciting work now in starting to think seriously about amenities and trying to, you know, at least relate them to observables. We have a very promising student on the job market who's thinking about racial inequality in cities and thinking about these amenity terms and how they relate to, you know, black-white interactions and such like. And I think there's exciting work there, but I share many of these reservations. But you know, at the same time, we're now being bombarded with more data than we can possibly deal with, and these types of frameworks obviously allow us to use a rich, you know, very disaggregated and detailed data, which is, you know, I think eventually going to be a huge plus. But again, we need to know how to use these tools to maximize what we're learning from these data.
Okay, I won't try to force you to offend your friends. And next question I like to ask people is about which of their papers they're most proud of. I know in my own case, it's not necessarily the ones that have received the most external notice, the most citations. Is there a paper that stands out in your mind that maybe it is one that's got a lot of citations? Anyway, is there one that stands ahead of the others that you're proud of?
I don't know if stands ahead. There's certainly one which I think maybe has been read less or had less influence than I think it deserves, and so maybe that one would be the closest to this, which is I have this paper on the impacts of retail globalization on households in Mexico, and this, you know, goes back to something you said right at the beginning of this interview. You've only had 2 students who were jointly supervised by you and Angus. I guess the other was Guido Porto.
Yes.
And, you know, starting with some work of Deaton, then followed up by Guido Porto, he wrote what I think is a fabulous job market paper, which was maybe held back by the data at the time and the methodologies of causal inference, or what was available in the time he had. and basically he shows that, you can get, and this is based on, some earlier work by Angus, but you can get quite a long way in kind of characterizing the welfare impacts of trade reforms or in general reforms that change prices through a whole bunch of kind of first order terms, many of which you can read off the data, others you kind of need more causal evidence for. And the world since then has advanced dramatically in terms of data access and also in terms of the availability of natural experiments and our thinking about such things. And the ability now for us to calculate extremely rich distributional effects to the first order using data that's now available, I think is an incredibly powerful tool, and I think trade economists should be using it much more. Then we can, go into some more complicated second order effects and the G effects as well, and that adds icing to the cake, but we can learn an enormous amount with a reasonably limited number of assumptions from, just looking at things such as, what share of your consumption is exported or imported from abroad or subject to particular tariff lines and such like. And now, I'm working with Dave Donaldson and co-authors currently on a project in Chile where we're actually able to see kind of the individual products that the consumers purchase from which firms, thanks to their incredibly elaborate VAT collection data. So there you can start to see how you can really make enormous progress on working out the impacts of trade reforms or other price-changing reforms. And that paper tries to do that for the impact of the arrival of foreign supermarkets in Mexico, and I think we make a lot of progress in really widening that toolkit in terms of allowing for a quite wide range of impacts to be credibly identified and then kind of put into this framework of these first order impacts of price changes.
I'm very much a fan of that paper as well. But there was one piece of a sentence that just prompted a different question. Can we ever have too much data? Can it lead us to focus on trivia and lose the big pictures? Do we sometimes want to aggregate or not focus on, whether the shipments were in red boxes or blue boxes just because the data set tells us that?
I think one of the challenges I found hardest in my career, at least, is when you do have an extremely rich data set, is working out how to not get tangled up in those minutiae and kind of step back to what is actually the valuable information. And you're exactly right that it's not just that we are spending too much time on the red and the blue, it's that you might not make any progress and ever write that paper because you haven't worked out a way to aggregate the data in some way that you're able to pull out meaningful economic relationships. And so I think that's a big problem. This is also related to this quantification discussion we had a little before, which is when you are confronted with these huge data sets, and now we have these machines that are obviously well suited to utilize those huge data sets, it is low-hanging fruit. I have huge data set that people will like, plus machine that can use that data set. And I think one thing that's missing there, and the most important one, is what's the question? Is there an interesting economic mechanism, interesting forces to uncover? And those three together can be very powerful. But starting with just the first two, you may never develop that interesting question and the economics behind it.
In my day, the version of that was being told that when people had to calculate regressions by hand, they were very careful on which regression they calculated and didn't try hundreds of them to get them back in a fraction of a second.
Yeah, that's definitely changed.
Let's wrap up by talking just a little bit about teaching and advising. It's been a while since you've been a student. You have classes and advisees of your own, of course. You enjoy these roles? Would you say there's something distinctive about your approach? Did we teach you well how to do it at Princeton? And then which of your students are you most proud of?
Excellent question. So I don't know how distinctive. I guess one thing we do continue to do at MIT, which very much comes from you, is there's Arno Costino there as well, who was also a Princeton student. Is we're very we find it very important to intersperse theory with empirics in our trade course. In many schools, I guess there would be a more theoretical side, then maybe they'd teach the empirics separately or some subset. Here we kind of jump back between us week by week or class by class in order to teach the relevant empirical work straight after the theory, to try and keep those connections tight. So I think that's something we certainly learned and has been very valuable, I think, to the students. In terms of a distinct style, I don't know how distinct it is, but I do feel very strongly that you want to get students excited by the research questions and by the topics. I still remember me, I guess, complaining to you during class when there was something that didn't seem first order importance, and then we got to, I think it was a Venables-Krugman or Krugman-Venables paper, and you said, is this important enough for you, David? Is this an explanation of the whole world through history or something? So I do think it's important to get the students excited, and one area to do that is to kind of highlight gaps between kind of where policy discussions are, where big concerns in the world are, and where our research is. So, for example, recently I've tried to add to the course a little bit on multinationals and taxation and tax evasion. It's not an area where we really have much research, if at all. There's maybe one paper, but spending some time on that at least highlights this is an area we should have much more, and then maybe you have to put blog posts in the slides and such like, but hoping to push students into these understudied areas, I think, has high returns. And this comes back to the discussion we had a few minutes ago, which is really great job market paper often needs a hook, a question, something interesting that catches people's attention, and if you start out with that, then the path is a lot easier than having most of the paper but no hook, and then having to try and work out how to make the thing that you've already done 3/4 of interesting.
So let me ask you, before we turn to advising, one question on teaching. So my approach, if you remember, was very much an integrative approach. I tried to teach the lessons of the theory rather than particular papers. Esteban, for example, my colleague of many years, very much likes to go carefully through leading papers. I think both of those methods can work. Do you have your style lean one way or the other?
So I mainly teach the empirical components, and for that, I guess we do a bit of both. Certainly, I've been pushing the syllabus as is, was more your summary style, and I've added a few more, as we adjusted the course, I've added a few more deep dives. I think with empirical work, you do learn a lot about the decisions they made, why did they decide to do this, discussions in class about is this credible, how could it be better. That's part of I think how you learn that craft. My thought is with more theoretical papers, a lot of that craft is also learned by doing it, and particularly more quantitative exercises. So I can also see how you need to be talked through one to give you confidence, and then you get a nightmarish problem set that takes you weeks of your life, but then you have learned some serious skills. It's a little hard to get people to actually do empirical works, and so much of that is thinking through endogeneity concerns and coming up with a valid methodology, which is hard to do for a problem set, although certainly implementation is something we can do. So I guess I think a bit of both. You want to know where the literature is, what we've learned, but at the same time you want to have the chance to kind of go through some of the thought processes in writing an empirical paper, which takes maybe half a class going through one paper to do.
Do you give your students data sets and have them do work on those data, or is that more left for a third-year paper and the like?
We do a bit of that. maybe not so much in the sense, at least for the trait course, just because I guess the thought is that often the empirical students are also taking courses where they're doing more of that, and we naturally spend a lot of time, for good or for bad, on some of these quantitative exercises, which do take a lot of practice, as well as some of the canonical theoretical models, which, knowing them back to front, has high returns. So we maybe have one assignment which involves much more data work of the sort you described.
So let's finish up with advising. A quote I like was from the physicist Feynman, who said that advising Ph.D. students is a lot like doing research, but with your hands tied behind your back. Are you a very active advisor? Do you enjoy the advising?
I do enjoy advising. It's, I guess, it's like doing research, but without maybe having to do all the boring bits in between those meetings where you actually have to implement the things you discuss. And obviously, it's a real pleasure to see your students succeed and thrive, and go off and do great work at their respective institutions. Yeah, it's certainly one of the, I think, perks of the job. At least good students are a perk of the job. And then otherwise, I think it's an important part of working in universities is to make sure that we provide a good learning environment to all our students as well. And so that's also something which I value, even if office hours with undergraduates or something just before the exam is not the highlight of my week.
So one of your excellent students, recent students, just arrived in Princeton yesterday. Mayara Felix is going to be our postdoc this year, and I know you think very highly of her, and we're really looking forward to spending the year with her.
Yeah, we were thrilled. Yes, we were thrilled. She decided to go back to Princeton to learn from the wonderful faculty there, just as we benefited from earlier in our careers. And as you say, she's wonderful, brings a huge amount of energy, ideas, and she's also a wonderful person. So you will enjoy the year with her.
Great. Well, let's wrap this up. So let me thank you so much for doing this. And it was great to see you in person recently in Cambridge. And I'm very much looking forward. As you know, I have a grandson in Cambridge now, so I guess we'll be seeing more of each other than during the pandemic, at least.
I very much look forward to it. And thank you so much for chatting. That was a lot of fun.
Great.